For 6 months, everyone at Magnolia Grove Plantation believed that Patience was simply tending the beehives to produce honey and wax. Master Cornelius Whitfield even praised the work of the 38-year-old enslaved woman, proud of how his beeswax candles illuminated the dining hall during the elegant dinners he hosted for the wealthy neighbors of Wilkinson County, Georgia. But on the night of August 17th, 1862, while 8 people dined and laughed in the main hall of the big house, celebrating the recent acquisition of 20 new slaves purchased at auction in Savannah, the truth revealed itself brutally and inescapably. Patience was not producing honey. She was raising a lethal army. Thousands of African bees, trained through ancestral Yoruba techniques transmitted by her mother, poured through the chimneys of the big house like a black, buzzing river. Within minutes, the dining hall transformed into a chamber of indescribable horror. Screams pierced the Georgia night as swarms attacked faces, throats, eyes. Doors blocked from the outside prevented any escape. Windows nailed shut days before under the pretext of repairs became death traps. 8 people died that night, including Cornelius Whitfield, his wife Constance, the brutal overseer Marcus Hayden, 2 drivers, and 3 visitors from neighboring plantations. But these bees did not attack by chance. They were manipulated, provoked, and directed by a woman who transformed 6 months of silent patience into meticulously orchestrated vengeance. A woman whose 12-year-old son had been sold in February of that year to a cotton plantation in the deep Mississippi. Ripped from her arms while she begged on her knees, only for Whitfield to spit in her face and say that Negroes don't have families, just breeding stock. Does that August night, Patience proved that the enslaved were not animals without memory. They were patient strategists. They were ancestral warriors. And when provoked beyond endurance, they became death itself. The story begins not with violence, but with loss. Not with rage, but with a mother's love, torn apart by the casual cruelty of men who believed themselves gods simply because the law allowed them to own other human beings. Magnolia Grove Plantation sprawled across 4,000 acres of prime Georgia soil in Wilkinson County, 20 miles south of Milledgeville, the state capital. The plantation produced primarily cotton, king cotton, as Southerners called it with religious reverence, but also maintained extensive vegetable gardens, orchards, livestock, and notably a dozen beehives that provided honey, wax, and a symbol of genteel sophistication for Master Whitfield's carefully cultivated image as a progressive plantation owner. The reality beneath this veneer of civilization was far darker. 237 enslaved people lived and died on Magnolia Grove, their bodies property, their children inventory, their suffering invisible to the white society that profited from their forced labor. The year was 1862. The Civil War raged to the north and east, but in central Georgia, the plantations continued much as they had for generations. Sherman's march to the sea was still 2 years away. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation would not take effect until January 1st, 1863, and even then it would not apply to border states or areas under Union control. For the enslaved people of Magnolia Grove, freedom remained a distant dream, attainable only through death or the nearly impossible feat of escape to Union lines hundreds of miles away through hostile territory patrolled by bloodhounds and armed militias. Patience had been born on Magnolia Grove 38 years earlier, in 1824, but her mother had been born free in Yorubaland, in what is now southwestern Nigeria, before being captured at age 16 during a raid by rival tribes and sold to Portuguese slavers. Her mother's name had been Abini, which meant, "We asked for her, and she arrived," but the white men who owned her renamed her simply Grace. A bitter irony for a woman who would know no grace in her short, brutal life. Abeni died when Patience was only 7 years old. worked to death in the cotton fields under a merciless overseer who believed that enslaved people were more productive when terrified. But in those 7 precious years, Abeni had transmitted crucial knowledge to her daughter. Stories of their homeland, techniques of survival, and most importantly, the sacred relationship between the Yoruba people and the bees. In Yoruba land, beekeeping was not merely agriculture but spiritual practice. Bees were messengers between the human world and the world of the Orishas, the divine spirits who governed existence. Honey was sacred food, beeswax illuminated shrines, and certain priestesses, those with the gift, could communicate with the colonies, guide them, and in times of war, direct them as living weapons against enemies. Abeni had been one such priestess before her capture. In whispered conversations in the darkness of the slave quarters, she taught her daughter the clicking sounds that calmed aggressive bees, the plant mixtures that attracted or repelled them, the smoke techniques that rendered them docile, and most dangerous of all, the provocations that transformed them into instruments of divine retribution. Patience grew up small and quiet, observing everything, saying little. She learned early that survival for enslaved women meant making yourself useful enough to keep but invisible enough to avoid unwanted attention. She worked in the big house as a child, cleaning and serving, then in the kitchen as she grew older, learning to cook the elaborate meals that white families consumed while enslaved people survived on cornmeal and salt pork. She was 22 when the previous plantation owner died, and Cornelius Whitfield, then 35 and newly wealthy from fortunate investments in cotton speculation, purchased Magnolia Grove at auction. She was 23 when Whitfield noticed her, commanded her to his bedroom, and began the pattern of sexual violence that would continue intermittently for years. She was 24 when she gave birth to a son. The boy's father was Cornelius Whitfield, though he would never acknowledge this publicly. The child had his light brown eyes and the same distinctive shape of his ears. Patience named him Samuel, after the prophet who anointed kings. From his first breath, Samuel was everything to her, in a world where she owned nothing, not even her own body. This child was purpose incarnate. She poured into him every fragment of knowledge, every story, every hope for a different future. She taught him to read in secret, tracing letters in the dirt behind the quarters and wiping them away before anyone could see. She taught him the stories her mother had taught her. She showed him which plants healed and which killed. She loved him with the fierce totality that only those who have had everything stolen can understand. Samuel was brilliant and beautiful and utterly doomed by the same legal system that considered him 3/5 of a person. As he grew, his resemblance to Whitfield became more pronounced, a visible reminder of the master's violence that Constance Whitfield, the master's wife, could not ignore. Constance was a thin, bitter woman of 42, childless after 17 years of marriage, sustained by laudanum and religious certainty that slavery was divinely ordained. She had arrived from Charleston society with lace and china and unshakable conviction in white supremacy, and she poured her considerable capacity for cruelty into the enslaved people she saw as both less than human and somehow threatening to her tenuous position. For 12 years, Patience managed to keep Samuel close, maneuvering him away from field work that would have destroyed his body before adulthood, teaching him skills that might someday purchase his freedom. He worked in the stables, learned blacksmithing from the plantation's skilled metalworker, showed such aptitude with horses that even Whitfield grudgingly praised his abilities. For 12 years, Patience lived in the precarious hope that perhaps somehow her son might survive into a different world. That hope died on February 14th, 1862, Valentine's Day, when Cornelius Whitfield sold Samuel for $1,200 to a cotton broker from Natchez, Mississippi. The decision was Constance's revenge, delivered with smiling malice. She had seen Patience teaching the boy to read, She had noticed how Whitfield sometimes watched Samuel with an expression that might have been paternal pride in any other context. She demanded the sale, framing it as economic necessity. Cotton prices were high. The boy would fetch an excellent price, and his obvious intelligence would make him valuable to a cotton operation that needed skilled labor. What she meant, and what everyone understood, was that she could not tolerate the visible evidence of her husband's sexual exploitation of his property. The boy had to go. Patience learned of the sale the morning it happened. She was working in the kitchen when she heard the wagon, looked out, and saw Samuel being loaded in chains alongside 4 other enslaved people Whitfield had decided to liquidate for cash. She ran. For the only time in her life, she abandoned caution and ran screaming across the yard to the wagon, fell to her knees, clutched at her son's shackled ankles, begged with an abandon that surrendered all dignity because dignity meant nothing compared to this child. Samuel was crying, calling for her, pulling against the chains, 12 years old and terrified, and being sold away from the only person who loved him into the hell of Mississippi cotton country, where enslaved people were worked to death in 5 years on average, because it was cheaper to work them to death and buy replacements than to maintain them adequately for longer service. Cornelius Whitfield stood watching, bourbon glass in hand, expression bored. When Patience's begging became too loud, too disruptive to the transaction, he walked over, looked down at her, and delivered the words that would seal his fate. "Get up, Grace," he said, using the name her mother had been forced to accept. "Negroes don't have families. You don't have a son. You had breeding stock, and I've sold it at excellent profit. That's all this is. Business. Now get back to the kitchen before I have Marcus teach you proper behavior." She looked up at him, this man who had raped her, who had created this child, who was now selling that child into probable death, and she saw in his eyes absolute emptiness. He felt nothing, no guilt, no recognition, no humanity toward her at all. She was furniture that had unexpectedly developed the capacity to speak. The wagon pulled away. Samuel's screams faded into the distance. The broker had paid in gold, counted into Whitfield's hand, while a mother's world ended. Patience did not scream again, did not cry, did not beg. She stood slowly, wiped the dirt from her dress, and walked with mechanical precision back to the kitchen. The other enslaved people watched her with knowing sorrow. They had all lost children. The slave system devoured families like hungry gods devoured sacrifices. But those who knew Patience well, who had seen her mother's daughter emerge occasionally in flashes of ancestral knowledge, those few felt a tremor of premonition. There was something in her eyes, something cold and patient and utterly unforgiving. That night, alone in the darkness of her cabin in the quarters, Patience performed a ritual her mother had taught her, but that she had never before attempted. She drew symbols in the dirt floor with her finger. She mixed herbs, devil's shoestring for binding enemies, graveyard dust collected from the burial ground where her mother rested, red pepper for revenge, sulfur for destruction. She lit a stolen candle, let the wax drip into the mixture, and spoke words in Yoruba that her mother had whispered decades ago. She called on the spirits of her ancestors, on the Orishas who governed justice, on the terrible powers that watched over those who had been wronged beyond endurance. And she made a vow. Samuel would be avenged. Cornelius Whitfield would die screaming. Constance would die in terror. Marcus Hayden, the overseer who had sold the rope that bound her son, would die choking. Every person who had participated in this theft, this murder of her soul, would pay in exact proportion to their crime. But she would not be rash. Rashness meant death. The South was littered with the bodies of enslaved people who had struck back in rage and been tortured to death as public examples. No, she would be what her mother had named her. She would be Patience. She would wait. She would plan. She would smile and cook and serve and tend the bees that Whitfield had assigned her to manage 6 months earlier when his previous beekeeper died of fever. She would be invisible and useful and utterly harmless, and when the moment came, when every detail aligned, she would unleash hell itself. The transformation was invisible to everyone but her. She went through the motions of enslaved existence. She woke before dawn when the bell rang. She built fires in the big house kitchen. She prepared breakfast for the white family, while enslaved field hands ate hasty cornmeal before being driven to the cotton fields. She cooked elaborate dinners, roasted meats and baked breads, and churned butter and preserved fruits, creating abundance for the family that had destroyed her only source of joy. But inside, she was changed utterly. The part of her that had been Patience the enslaved woman, the part that had hoped for small mercies and dreamed of gradual manumission, was dead. What remained was something older, something that had crossed the Atlantic in chains, but had never been truly enslaved. She was her mother's daughter. She was Yoruba. She was a priestess of the bees, and she would have vengeance. The beehives became her laboratory and her arsenal. Magnolia Grove maintained 12 hives positioned at the edge of the plantation's extensive gardens. The previous beekeeper had been an elderly enslaved man named Moses, who had managed them competently for decades, producing the honey that sweetened the white family's tea and the wax that made their candles. When Moses died, Whitfield had looked around for a replacement and settled on Patience, who had occasionally helped Moses and who seemed docile enough to trust with the task. It was, from Whitfield's perspective, a practical decision. From the perspective of divine justice, it was the instrument of his destruction being placed directly in his victim's hands. Patience began her education. She spent hours at the hives, learning their rhythms, their patterns, their moods. African bees, Apis mellifera scutellata, were different from the gentler European varieties, more aggressive, more defensive, quicker to swarm, more likely to attack in massive numbers when provoked. They had been brought to the Americas by Spanish and Portuguese colonizers and had thrived in the warm southern climate. Most beekeepers feared them and kept only European strains. But Moses had maintained both varieties, and the African colonies were larger, more productive, and far more dangerous. Patience focused on the African hives. She remembered her mother's teachings, the songs and clicks and movements that communicated with the colonies. She practiced daily, speaking to them in Yoruba, offering them honey water mixed with specific plants, learning which herbs attracted them and which repelled them. She discovered that colonies could be trained, conditioned through patient repetition, to associate certain scents with food and others with threats. She learned their queen's location in each hive, learned to recognize the different roles, the workers who gathered pollen, the drones who existed only to mate, the guards who defended the entrance, the undertakers who removed the dead. She learned that bees communicated through dance, through pheromones, through vibrations, and she learned how to manipulate these communications. From March through July, she worked. To any observer, she was simply an enslaved woman doing her assigned task, harvesting honey, collecting wax, maintaining the hives. But she was conducting experiments. She would place drops of Whitfield's cologne, a distinctive scent of tobacco and vetiver, near hive entrances, and then introduce agitation, smoking the hive gently to associate the scent with disturbance. She collected fabric from Whitfield's clothes, pieces of his hair from his brush, anything carrying his scent, and systematically taught the colonies to recognize it as threat. She did the same with Constance's lavender perfume, with Marcus Hayden's sweat-soaked hat, with the specific scents of the two drivers who had laughed while loading Samuel onto the wagon. She was programming living weapons, creating associations between scents and attack responses, training tens of thousands of bees to recognize her enemies. The technical challenge was enormous. Bees did not attack on command like dogs. They responded to immediate threats, to disturbance of their hive, to attack pheromones released by other bees. But Patience discovered that through careful manipulation, moving hives to create defensiveness, restricting entrances to increase aggression, introducing competitor hives to trigger territorial responses. She could create colonies that were hair-trigger sensitive, ready to explode into defensive fury at minimal provocation. By July, she had 3 hives of African bees that were weaponized nightmares. Each colony contained approximately 40,000 bees. If fully provoked, they would pursue targets for over a quarter mile, stinging repeatedly. A few dozen stings could incapacitate an adult. Several hundred could kill. Several thousand released simultaneously in an enclosed space would be absolutely lethal. But weaponizing the bees was only half the equation. She needed delivery mechanism, timing, and escape plan. She needed the perfect scenario where all her targets would be gathered together, where she could trigger the attack, and where she could maintain plausible deniability. The opportunity came from Whitfield's vanity. In early August, he announced a dinner party for August 17th to celebrate his recent purchase of 20 new enslaved people. A significant expansion of Magnolia Grove's labor force that he wanted to showcase to neighboring plantation owners. He invited 3 other substantial landowners with their wives, creating a gathering of exactly 8 people in the big house dining hall. It was perfect. All her primary targets in one location. Patience began final preparations. The dining hall had 2 large fireplaces with chimneys that rose 3 stories. The windows were large and numerous. The doors were solid oak. If she could block the exits and deliver the bees through the chimneys, she could transform the elegant room into a death trap. Over the next 2 weeks, she worked with exquisite care. She volunteered to clean the dining hall thoroughly before the party, allowing her to examine every detail. She noted that the windows had internal latches that could be secured from outside if she could access them earlier. She observed that the doors opened inward, meaning they could be blocked from outside. She measured the chimneys and confirmed they were wide enough to drop entire hive frames down. She prepared her tools. She stole nails and a hammer from the carpenter's shed, hiding them in the garden. She collected cloth soaked in her target's scents and placed them strategically around the dining hall during her cleaning. Whitfield's cologne on the curtains by his seat, Constance's lavender on the tablecloth near her place setting, creating a scent map that would guide the bees to specific targets. She selected her 3 most aggressive African hives and began subtle modifications. She slightly restricted their entrances, increasing defensive behavior. She relocated them closer to the big house over several nights, moving them incrementally so the colonies wouldn't abscond. By August 16th, the hives were positioned just 50 feet from the big house, close enough for rapid deployment, but not so close as to raise suspicion. She rehearsed her timeline. The dinner would begin at 7 in the evening, as was Whitfield's custom. By 8, they would be well into the meal, relaxed with wine, doors closed against the August heat, windows latched to keep out mosquitoes. That would be her moment. The night of August 16th, Patience did not sleep. She lay in her cabin, reviewing every detail, every contingency. She had planned for 6 months. Tomorrow, she would execute justice, but there was one element she had not fully confronted until now, the certainty of her own death. There was no scenario where she survived this. Either she would be caught and executed, or she would successfully flee and be hunted down. An enslaved woman who killed white people, especially wealthy plantation owners, would be pursued by every militia and patrol in Georgia. Even if she made it to Union lines in Tennessee, the journey was hundreds of miles through hostile territory. Her life was over the moment she dropped those hives down the chimney. She made peace with this. Some things mattered more than survival. Her son mattered more. Justice mattered more. Proving that enslaved people were not passive victims, but agents capable of terrible retribution, mattered more. If her death could put fear into the hearts of slaveholders, could make them hesitate before selling the next child, could inspire the next enslaved person to resistance, then her death had meaning. She thought of Samuel, 12 years old, probably in a Mississippi cotton field at this very moment, exhausted and brutalized and alone. She thought of her mother, Abeni, worked to death in these same fields. She thought of the 237 other enslaved people on this plantation and the millions across the South, and she understood that she was not just avenging one child. She was striking back against the entire system. One blow, one night of terror. One demonstration that the enslaved were not property, but human beings capable of sophisticated planning and devastating violence when driven past endurance. Tomorrow night, Cornelius Whitfield and everyone who had participated in the theft of her son would understand in their final moments of agony that they had been wrong. Enslaved people did have families, they did have love, they did have memory, and they had rage. August 17th, 1862 dawned hot and humid, typical for Georgia in August. The sky was cloudless, pale blue fading to white at the horizon. By noon, the temperature climbed past 95 degrees. Enslaved field hands labored in the cotton under the brutal sun, while patients worked in the kitchen, preparing the elaborate dinner that would be her target's last meal. She cooked with mechanical precision, roasted duck with cherry sauce, candied yams, fresh green beans, cornbread with honey butter, peach cobbler made from the plantation's own orchards. She prepared everything to absolute perfection, knowing that the meal itself was theater, a final performance of the obedient enslaved cook before the curtain fell on this particular act of American horror. Constance Whitfield came into the kitchen twice to inspect progress, criticizing the placement of garnish on the duck, demanding the table settings be checked again, exercising the petty tyranny available to white women whose only power came through their husbands' ownership of other human beings. Patients nodded at each instruction, said "Yes, mistress," with appropriate deference, and imagined bees pouring over that pinched, cruel face. Marcus Hayden, the overseer, appeared at the kitchen door at 3 in the afternoon, ostensibly to inform patients that she would need to serve during dinner. He was a large man of 37, 6 feet 3 inches, heavily muscled from years of physical labor before becoming overseer, with cold blue eyes and hands that had wielded whips for a decade. He leaned against the doorframe, looking her over with the casual assessment of a man who considered enslaved women available for his use whenever convenient. "You clean up nice when you try, Patience," he said. "Maybe after the guests leave, you and I should have a conversation about your work performance." It was barely coded. Everyone knew what conversations with Marcus meant. Patience looked at the floor, appropriately submissive, and said, "I just want to do my work, sir." He laughed. "That's what I'm talking about, doing your work, all of it." He left. Patience continued preparing dinner, her hands steady, her expression neutral. Inside, she was counting hours. 6 more hours. Marcus Hayden would not touch another enslaved woman ever again. The guests arrived at 6:30. Patience watched from the kitchen as carriages pulled up to the big house, disgorging plantation owners and their wives in evening finery. There was Josiah Pemberton and his wife Magnolia, owners of Oak Haven Plantation 10 miles east. There was Thurston Blackwood and his wife Savannah, who operated Riverside Plantation to the south. And there was Montgomery Caldwell and his wife Prudence, from Willowbrook Plantation to the west. These 3 couples, together with Cornelius and Constance Whitfield, represented the cream of Wilkinson County society, collectively owning over 800 enslaved people and controlling thousands of acres of prime cotton land. They gathered in the parlor for pre-dinner drinks. Patients served bourbon and sherry, circulating silently with a tray, invisible as furniture. She listened to their conversation, the casual cruelty embedded in every word. Josiah Pemberton bragged about a breeding program that had produced 12 new slave children in the past year. Thurston Blackwood complained about a runaway who had been caught and returned, debating whether to sell him down river or make an example through public whipping. Montgomery Caldwell discussed cotton prices and speculated about how the war might affect international markets. Their wives discussed fashion, household management, and the challenges of controlling enslaved domestic workers. Magnolia Pemberton complained that her cook had ruined a roast. Savannah Blackwood shared her technique for breaking the will of resistant slave women. Prudence Caldwell recommended her husband's overseer, who had a reputation for efficient brutality. Patience served and smiled and nodded and filed away every word as additional justification. These people, all of them, were complicit. All of them perpetuated the system. All of them deserved what was coming. At 7 o'clock precisely, Constance Whitfield announced dinner. The guests moved to the dining hall, admiring the table settings, the crystal and china, the elaborate centerpiece of magnolia flowers. They took their seats. Cornelius at the head, Constance at the foot, the guests arrayed along both sides. 8 people, 8 targets. Patience served the first course with help from 2 other enslaved houseworkers, an elderly man named Benjamin and a young woman named Sophronia. Neither knew what was about to happen. Patience had told no one. This was her vengeance, her responsibility, her damnation to bear alone. The dinner progressed. The guests ate and drank and laughed. The candles burned. The windows remained latched. The doors stayed closed to keep the dining hall's cooler air from escaping into the August evening. Everything was perfect. At 8:15, Patience excused herself to fetch more wine from the cellar. Instead, she slipped out the kitchen door into the gathering darkness. The sun had set. Twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and deep blue. She moved quickly to the tool shed, retrieved the hammer and nails she had hidden, and approached the big house from the rear. The dining hall windows were large, but latched from inside as she had anticipated. However, she had prepared for this. Earlier in the day, while cleaning, she had loosened several window frames, creating gaps just wide enough to slip a blade through and manipulate the latches from outside. She worked quickly, securing each window shut with nails driven through the frame into the sill, making them impossible to open from inside. 8 windows, 16 nails. The sound of hammering was covered by the laughter and conversation from inside. Next, the doors, the main entrance and the door to the parlor, both opened inward. She positioned heavy oak benches against each, then reinforced them with iron bars from the garden fence. The doors were now impassable from inside. The entire process took 12 minutes. She worked in near darkness, her hands guided by 6 months of planning and visualization. When finished, she stood back and examined her work. The dining hall was now a sealed chamber. Her targets were trapped inside, unaware that their elegant prison had been locked. Phase 2. The bees. She ran to the 3 hives she had prepared, 50 feet from the big house. The colonies were agitated from her earlier preparations. She had restricted their entrances and introduced smoke periodically throughout the day, making them defensive and ready to attack. Now she opened each hive fully, removed entire frames, dense, with 40,000 bees per hive, and carried them to the big house roof. She climbed, using the exterior kitchen stairs, ascending to the roof with frames of living fury in her hands. The bees buzzed around her, confused, aggressive, but not yet fully attacking because she had covered herself in smoke earlier and moved with the slow, careful movements her mother had taught her. She positioned herself above the dining hall chimneys. Inside, she could hear laughter. Constance was telling a story about a recent shopping trip to Savannah. The guests were enjoying peach cobbler. The wine flowed. They were comfortable, satiated, absolutely unprepared. Patience held a frame containing approximately 15,000 African bees above the first chimney. She thought of Samuel. She thought of her mother. She thought of every enslaved person who had ever lost a child to the auction block, every woman raped by her master, every man worked to death in the fields, every child torn from their family, every human being reduced to property, every soul crushed under the weight of a system built on stolen labor and institutionalized brutality. She dropped the frame down the chimney, then the second, then the third. 45,000 African bees, trained for 6 months to recognize the scents of their targets, poured down into the fireplaces and erupted into the dining hall. The sound that rose from inside the big house was unholy. Screaming, crashing, the thunder of bodies hitting walls and furniture. She scrambled down from the roof and positioned herself by the kitchen door, far enough away to maintain deniability, close enough to hear. Inside the sealed dining hall, hell had arrived. The bees emerged from both fireplaces in a black, roiling cloud, thousands upon thousands of them, filling the air, blotting out the candlelight. They found the scents patience had placed. They found the cologne and perfume and sweat. They attacked with the fury of 45,000 tiny weapons, each wielding a barbed stinger, delivering venom. Cornelius Whitfield was the first to react. He stood, chair crashing backward, batting at the cloud descending around him. He opened his mouth to shout an order, and bees flew into his mouth down his throat, stinging the soft tissues. He choked, gagged, fell to his knees, clawing at his face as bees covered him like a living shroud. His eyes swelled shut within seconds. His throat closed. He crawled toward the door, slammed against it, found it immovable. He pounded weakly, each movement attracting more bees to the vibration. Within 3 minutes, he had sustained over 800 stings. His heart, overwhelmed by venom, began to fail. He collapsed face down on the floor, his body jerking as the last stings penetrated his neck, his ears, every exposed inch of skin. He was dead within 5 minutes. Constance Whitfield's screams were the loudest. She had always been theatrical, prone to hysterics, and she met her death with pure panic. Bees targeted her lavender scent, swarming her hair, her dress, her face. She ran blindly, crashed into the table, fell, crawled under it, seeking shelter that did not exist. The bees followed. They covered her hands as she tried to protect her face. They found the gap between her gloves and sleeves, the space between her collar and neck. She screamed and screamed until her throat was so swollen she could not scream any more, only make high, keening sounds like a dying rabbit. She tore at her own skin, scratching wounds that invited more stings. She lost consciousness after 10 minutes and died after 15, her face unrecognizable, swollen to 3 times its normal size, her body a battlefield of venom. Marcus Hayden tried to fight. He grabbed a tablecloth, wrapped it around his head, and charged toward the door like a bull. He hit the oak benches Patience had placed and bounced backward into the swarm. He punched at the air, killing dozens of bees with each blow, but for every bee he killed, 100 more attacked. They found his ears, his nose, the corners of his eyes. They crawled inside his shirt, stinging his chest and back. He tried to rip his shirt off, but his hands were already too swollen to grip the fabric. He fell, rose, fell again. He crawled toward a window, found it nailed shut, pounded on it with fists that were ballooning grotesquely. The bees concentrated on his head. He took over 1,000 stings before he died, his body convulsing in toxic shock, his last coherent thought probably recognition that he was dying the way he had made others die, slowly, in agony, without mercy. The guests died more quickly, their bodies unprepared for the massive venom load. Josiah Pemberton clutched his chest as his heart failed after only 600 stings. Magnolia Pemberton went into anaphylactic shock, her throat closing completely, dying of suffocation, with her hands clawing at her neck. Thurston and Savannah Blackwood died together, collapsed against each other on the floor, their bodies intertwined in a grotesque final embrace. Montgomery Caldwell tried to hide inside a cabinet, pulling the door shut, but the bees followed him into the dark space and stung him to death in absolute darkness. Prudence Caldwell simply stood in the center of the room, hands over her face, accepting death with Southern lady stoicism until the venom made her heart stop. By 9 o'clock, all 8 were dead. The bees, having expended their fury, began to calm. Many had died, their stingers torn from their bodies in the act of stinging. Others crawled on the corpses, on the walls, on the overturned furniture. The dining hall was silent except for the buzzing. The candles had been knocked over in the chaos. Small fires smoldered on the tablecloth, but did not spread. There was no oxygen left to feed them, the rooms sealed too tightly. Patience heard the silence. She waited 30 more minutes to be certain. Then she approached the dining hall door, removed the oak benches and iron bars, and opened it slowly. The sight that greeted her was apocalyptic. 8 bodies sprawled across the floor, barely recognizable as human. Faces swollen beyond identification, exposed skin black with stings, eyes bulged shut, mouths open in final screams, blood from where fingernails had scratched desperately at swelling flesh, bees everywhere, on everything. Crawling, dying, still buzzing faintly, the smell of death, venom, perfume, wine, and blood. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. She had imagined this scene for 6 months. The reality was both worse and more satisfying than imagination. These people had believed themselves untouchable, protected by law and custom and the color of their skin. They had died in terror, understanding in their final moments that they were not gods, but mere flesh, vulnerable, mortal, and hated with an intensity they had never comprehended. She felt no horror at what she had done, no regret, only a profound, settling sense of completion. Samuel was avenged. Her mother was avenged. Every enslaved person ever sold, raped, tortured, worked to death was avenged in some small measure. She closed the door. She removed the nails from the windows. She scattered the evidence of her preparations. She returned to the kitchen where Benjamin and Sophronia stood in shock, having heard the screaming, but not understanding what had happened. "Go to the quarters," Patience told them quietly. "Wake everyone. Tell them the masters are dead. Tell them the bees attacked. Tell them I've gone." "But where?" Benjamin started. "North," she said. "Tell them I've gone north." She took bread, dried meat, a canteen of water. She changed into dark clothes. She wrapped a cloth around her head. She took one last look at Magnolia Grove, this plantation where she had been born, where her mother had died, where her son had been stolen, where she had spent 38 years in bondage. Then Patience walked into the darkness, toward the North Star, toward Union lines 300 miles away, toward freedom or death, carrying with her the knowledge that she had struck one blow against the monstrous system that had devoured her life. Behind her, the discovery was beginning. The guests' drivers, waiting outside for their masters, grew concerned when no one emerged. One approached the big house, peered in a window, saw bodies, ran screaming. Within an hour, the alarm had spread. Riders galloped to neighboring plantations, a posse formed by midnight. The sheriff arrived from Milledgeville by 2 in the morning. The scene in the dining hall caused hardened men to vomit. The theory quickly formed. The bees had swarmed. Someone had sealed the room accidentally or in panic. The tragedy was unprecedented, but explicable. Then they noticed the frames, the hive frames lying in the fireplaces, the deliberately dropped frames. They examined the windows, found nail holes. They questioned Benjamin and Sophronia, who reluctantly revealed that Patience, the beekeeper, had disappeared. The realization hit like a second wave of horror. This was not an accident. This was murder. This was revenge. An enslaved woman had weaponized bees and assassinated 8 of the county's most prominent citizens. The panic was instantaneous and absolute. If one enslaved person could do this, what prevented others? How many cooks were planning poison? How many blacksmiths were preparing weapons? How many seemingly docile slaves were waiting for the right moment to strike? Rewards were posted. $1,000 for patients, dead or alive. $2,000. $3,000. The price eventually reached $5,000, an enormous sum, testament to the terror she had provoked. Militias combed the countryside. Bloodhounds tracked her scent north. Patrols stopped every black person on every road, enslaved or free. The search consumed resources and men for months. But Patience had planned well. She traveled only at night. She hid during the day in swamps and forests. She found safe houses on the Underground Railroad, whispered coordinates passed from one conductor to another. She crossed the Chattahoochee River, traversed the mountains of northern Georgia and eastern Tennessee, following routes pioneered by other freedom seekers. The journey took 3 months. She nearly died twice, once from fever, once when she was almost captured by slave catchers, but escaped by submerging herself in a river and breathing through a reed while dogs searched the banks above her. She crossed into Union-held territory in eastern Tennessee on November 22, 1862. A black regiment of the Union Army found her collapsed on a road, delirious with exhaustion, 40 pounds lighter than when she had left Georgia. They took her to a contraband camp, the camps established for formerly enslaved people fleeing to Union lines. She recovered slowly. When she was strong enough to speak coherently, she told her story to an abolitionist journalist who was documenting the testimonies of freedom seekers. He wrote it down, every detail, the sale of her son, the 6 months of planning, the training of the bees, the execution, the 8 deaths, the escape. He asked her if she regretted what she had done. She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering to waste space on regret. "I regret that I could not save my son," she said. "I regret that I could only kill 8 when the system has killed millions. I regret that I am free while millions remain enslaved. But do I regret making those 8 men and women understand, in their final moments, that we are human beings who love and remember and fight back? No, I do not regret that." The journalist published her story in abolitionist newspapers across the North. It was reprinted in William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, in Frederick Douglass's newspaper. It spread through Underground Railroad networks, whispered in slave quarters, sung in coded spirituals. The story grew, as stories do, acquiring mythic elements, but the core remained true. In the South, plantation owners read the accounts with visceral horror. Many sold their enslaved workers and moved to cities. Others implemented draconian security measures, food tasters, locked sleeping quarters for enslaved people, prohibition on any enslaved person having access to livestock, gardens, or tools. The cost of maintaining security rose dramatically. Insurance premiums increased. The economic calculation of slavery began to shift. Some historians argue that the Magnolia Grove massacre, as it came to be known, contributed to the collapse of Southern morale. When even the most docile-seeming enslaved person might be planning murder, when coffee might be poisoned and bees might be weapons, the psychological foundation of the slavery system cracked. The myth of the happy, loyal slave was revealed as the desperate fiction it had always been. Patience lived to see the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. She lived to see Lee's surrender in 1865. She lived to see the 13th Amendment abolish slavery across the United States. She never saw Samuel again. She tried to find him, writing letters to organizations that helped reunite separated families. She placed advertisements in newspapers. She traveled to Mississippi after the war to search, but records of enslaved people were sparse and often destroyed. Thousands of families never reunited. She never learned whether he survived the cotton fields or died young, as so many did. She settled in Ohio, in a small community of formerly enslaved people. She never kept bees again. She worked as a seamstress, as a cook, as a laundress. She attended church every Sunday. She taught children to read at a freedmen's school. She lived quietly, unremarkably, just another aging black woman in a country slowly, painfully, trying to reckon with its original sin. She died in 1897, 35 years after her night of vengeance. She was 73 years old. The obituary in the local black newspaper noted that she had been born enslaved and died free, that she had been a faithful church member and devoted teacher. It made no mention of what she had done in August of 1862. But in certain communities, the story was preserved, passed down through generations, told in whispers, then in celebrations, then in scholarly works as historians began to document the full reality of enslaved resistance. Patience became symbol and myth, the Hornet Queen, the woman who turned nature itself into a weapon against oppression. Her story joined thousands of others, the story of Margaret Garner, who killed her own daughter rather than see her return to slavery. The story of Harriet Tubman, who led hundreds to freedom and served as a Union spy. The story of Robert Smalls, who stole a Confederate ship and sailed to freedom. The story of Nat Turner, whose rebellion killed 55 white people and terrified the entire South. The story of Celia, who killed her enslaving rapist and was hanged for it. The stories of countless unnamed others who resisted in ways large and small, who poisoned and sabotaged and ran and fought and refused to accept their reduction to property. These stories matter because they destroy the lie that slavery was accepted by its victims. They prove that resistance was constant, that agency persisted even under the most brutal oppression, that human beings cannot be truly enslaved, no matter how comprehensive the legal and physical apparatus of bondage. Patience's story matters because it reveals that enslaved people were not passive victims waiting for white saviors, but active agents in their own liberation. It shows that intelligence, patience, specialized knowledge, and careful planning could turn even the most powerless person into someone capable of devastating resistance. It demonstrates that the enslaved understood their oppressors better than the oppressors understood themselves, could manipulate the very systems meant to control them, could transform the tools of their bondage into weapons of liberation. And it matters because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice and violence. Was what Patience did murder or warfare? Were her targets innocent or complicit? When legal systems offer no protection, when human beings are defined as property, when children can be legally stolen and sold, what forms of resistance are justified? Who gets to define terrorism versus legitimate resistance? Who gets to determine when violence is righteous? These questions don't have easy answers. But they are questions we must ask if we are to honestly reckon with American history. The same nation that celebrates violent revolution against British taxation must somehow reconcile itself with the fact that enslaved people had infinitely greater cause for violent resistance against a system that denied them every basic human right. Patience killed 8 people. Slavery killed millions. Which violence was greater? Which violence was evil? Which violence was justice? History has been written primarily by those in power, and those in power have always defined resistance by the oppressed as criminal while defining violence by the state as legitimate. But if we truly believe that all people are created equal, that they possess unalienable rights including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then we must acknowledge that enslaved people had the right to fight for those rights by any means necessary. Patience fought, she planned, she executed, she killed, and she freed herself. Her story is not a comfortable story. It should not be comfortable. comfortable stories about slavery are lies. The truth is bloody and brutal and enraging. The truth is that millions of people were kidnapped, transported in death ships, sold like cattle, worked to death, raped systematically, had their children stolen, and were denied every form of human dignity for 246 years. And the truth is that they fought back, always, in every way they could, with the tools available to them, which were sometimes nothing more than the knowledge passed down from ancestors and the natural world around them. Today, we tell this story not to glorify violence, but to honor resistance, to remember that oppression always generates opposition, to understand that systems built on injustice contain the seeds of their own destruction, to recognize that those who seem powerless often possess forms of power that their oppressors cannot imagine. We tell this story because patience deserves to be remembered not as a victim, but as a warrior. Because Samuel deserves to be remembered as a child, stolen by a system that valued profit over humanity. Because Abeni deserves to be remembered as a mother who passed on knowledge that would eventually bring justice. Because the 237 enslaved people of Magnolia Grove deserve to be remembered as human beings who endured hell and found ways to survive and sometimes to strike back. And we tell this story because the fight is not over. Slavery ended in 1865, but its legacies persist. Mass incarceration, systemic racism, economic inequality, police brutality, voter suppression, the destruction of black families and communities, the devaluation of black lives. These are the descendants of the slavery system, morphed and adapted, but still functioning to limit black freedom and extract black labor and black life. When we remember patience, we remember that resistance is possible, that careful planning and specialized knowledge can overcome seemingly impossible odds, that one person, properly motivated and strategically positioned, can shake an entire system, that the oppressed are not helpless, not passive, not content with their oppression. We remember her and we ask ourselves, what injustice am I witnessing today? What specialized knowledge do I possess? What systems of oppression can I disrupt? What would I risk for justice? What would I sacrifice for freedom? Patience risked everything. She sacrificed her security, her safety, possibly her life. She killed 8 people and freed herself, and put fear into the hearts of slaveholders across the South, and gave hope to enslaved people who heard her story whispered in the quarters and passed down through generations. On August 17, 1862, in a dining hall in Wilkinson County, Georgia, 45,000 African bees delivered a message that still echoes across time. We are not property. We are not passive. We are not forgiving. Strike us down and we will rise up. Steal our children and we will have vengeance. Enslave our bodies, but you will never enslave our minds or our capacity for resistance or our commitment to freedom and justice. The Hornet Queen flew free. Her wings carried her to liberation. Her sting brought death to tyrants. Her story reminds us that the buzzing of bees can sound like freedom when wielded by the right hands. Remember her name. Remember her courage. Remember that resistance is always possible, even under the most brutal oppression. Remember that freedom is worth any price. Remember that justice delayed is not justice denied if those who seek it are patient enough, smart enough, brave enough to wait for the perfect moment and then strike without mercy. Remember patience, remember Samuel. Remember the millions whose names we will never know, but whose resistance in forms large and small brought down the monstrous system that tried to reduce human beings to property. Their fight was not in vain. Their courage lives on. Their resistance continues in every person who refuses to accept injustice, who fights back against oppression, who believes that a better world is possible and is willing to sacrifice to create it. The bees taught us this. Even the smallest creature, properly motivated and strategically deployed, can bring down giants. Even the most powerless person, with patience and planning and ancestral knowledge, can change the world. This is the lesson of the Hornet Queen. This is the legacy of patience. This is why we remember. This is why we tell these stories. This is why the fight continues. Never forget. Never forgive. Never stop fighting for freedom and justice and the basic human dignity that every person deserves, but that systems of oppression have denied to millions. The bees remember. The story remembers. We remember. And remembering is resistance. Telling the truth is resistance. Honoring those who fought is resistance. And resistance, always and forever, is the only appropriate response to oppression. Remember the Hornet Queen. Remember what 45,000 bees can do when guided by a mother's love and a warrior's patience. Remember that justice, however delayed, however unconventional its delivery mechanism, will find those who commit evil and will hold them accountable. This is history, this is truth, this is resistance, this is memory, this is the story of Patience, the Hornet Queen, who killed 8 slaveholders with living weapons and flew free into the night, toward the North Star, toward freedom, toward the rest of her life lived on her own terms, never enslaved again, never silenced, never forgotten. If you believe that Black Lives Matter, that justice is worth fighting for, that history must be told honestly, no matter how uncomfortable the truth, then share this story. Comment below with the names of other resistance fighters who deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to this channel so these stories continue to be told. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter in the hidden history of American resistance. What would you have done in Patience's place? Was her vengeance justice or murder? How do we honor resistance without glorifying violence? These are the questions history demands we answer. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Let's have this conversation. Let's remember together. Let's resist together. Let's build a world where no mother ever has to choose between accepting her child's enslavement or becoming an instrument of terrible justice. Remember the Hornet Queen. Remember her courage. Remember that freedom is always worth fighting for. Remember that the fight continues.